Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We would like to extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. Welcome to the SDGs, Climate Change and City Symposium, and of course to this panel on urban planning for equity and climate resilience in our cities. My name is Stephanie Butcher. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Connected Cities Lab here at the University of Melbourne. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the panel here today that will be responding to the keynote video that you have no doubt already watched. So we have with us here today Dr. Anna Hurlimann. Anna is the Associate Professor and Assistant Dean Diversity and Inclusion of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. That's in the University of Melbourne. We have with us here today also Dr. Shipra Narang, who is the Chief of the Urban Practices Branch and Global Solutions Division from UN Habitat. And of course, who you all well know, Dr. Theresa Williamson, Executive Director of Catalytic Communities, Brazil. And you can please feel free to refer to the full program for a much more extensive bio of all the amazing work that our panelists have been doing. So I'd like to open this first part of the session with some of my own reflections, listening to this fantastic presentation that Theresa left with us here today. And I'd like to, again, firstly thank Theresa for, in fact, giving this incredible overview of 20 years of work that has been going on with Catalytic Communities. And also, of course, to thank, in fact, both Theresa and Shipra for joining us at very opposite ends of the time zones, and not very nice times indeed at all. So thanks very much for being here. But Theresa, I'd like to start by saying that for me, your work has really left a number of provocations in teasing out, in a way, both the possibilities and the contradictions of the role of urban planning and indeed the SDGs in contributing to equity. And I think the way that you have opened your presentation by grounding us in those specific contours and histories of Rio, it tells us something really important in this tension between the universality of the SDGs agenda, which of course, in a way, is one of its greatest strengths, but also the specificity of place, which will inherently shape the possibilities for how this global universal agenda is localized. And for me, in foregrounding these histories of Rio, you really challenge us to ask some more difficult questions about what it means to reckon with these histories of colonialism and dispossession, the production of precarity through urban policies over time, and those embedded legacies of ethnic and racial and spatial injustices that continue as a result of those processes. Issues which are, of course, playing out in all manners of ways across global North and South. And the Black Lives Matter movement is, of course, one example of that. And I think really in owning this history so centrally in the work that you presented to us here today, you invite us to move beyond some of those more explicit entry points for discussing planning in the SDGs, inequitable access to services, participation in planning and decision-making, but actually to really think about those historical and institutional processes which are underpinning those exclusions and how that will shape our ability fundamentally to achieve more sustainable or equitable cities. And I think your work is so important for us, not only because it invites this critical reflection, but also because you don't leave us hanging there in the uncertainty and in the critique in a way, but you've also started to chart for us some pathways forward for trying to negotiate some of these processes. And of course, some of those lessons that you've offered us is in the role of CATCOM in reframing how we think of informality, the value that informality and favela neighborhoods can add to our cities and our sustainability aspirations. And for me, that work of CATCOM is modeling not only these really tangible, sustainable practices of the network and the ways in which you use tactics such as mapping and collective learning and peer-to-peer exchange to actually address some of those challenges around clean water, energy, but actually to more fundamentally reshape who's being recognized in the city and who's really seen as a producer of knowledge to meet those demands of the SDGs. And for me, that ultimately grounds us now, not just in sustainability, but also in justice. And the second lesson that you've really left me with, which I'll leave here now, and which I thought was really, really fascinating, and something I hadn't thought much about till now, is really about this added layer of the SDGs that you bring when you think about grounding it in community action. And thinking about the specificity of place and how that generates a number of missing issues, or where you go beyond the SDGs, in thinking about rootedness and belonging, autonomy or self-determination, stigma, media representation, and thinking also about how some of these more intangible dynamics shape our global aspirations of resilience, justice, or sustainability. And I think these areas, they move us, sort of out of the realm of quantifiable measurements, indicators, targets of the SDGs, and into that field of emotions, subjectivities, stories, histories. And I think these two are deeply linked with this justice agenda. And so I'm just absolutely excited and grateful to have this panel of amazing leaders here today, who in different ways, I think, have been exploring urban planning processes through their institutions, which really seek to speak to some of these structural aspects of inequality and of justice, often in quite innovative ways. So with that, I'd love to pass to some of my colleagues, and I would invite Anna to give us some comments on the work that she has been doing in Australia.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you, Theresa, very much for your keynote presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I also learnt a lot. And I'm really pleased that it brings attention in this symposium to issues of achieving the SDGs in developing nation contexts. Your presentation really highlights the many inequalities that exist still within urban planning, and how there's great potential for urban planning, urban decision makers and governments to do much more to reduce these inequalities. You also highlight the strength and resilience of Rio's favela communities despite these inequalities that they've experienced, and for me this is really inspiring. My work on urban planning, equity and climate change has mainly focused on communities in Australia, with particular attention to communities in rural locations who are more socioeconomically vulnerable than the average Australian. And while these inequalities are different to those experienced in the favela communities you spoke of, there are some similarities. Funded by a 4-year Australian Research Council linkage project, my colleagues and I conducted a project titled Equitable Outcomes in Adaptation to Climate Change. Our work had a particular focus on the issue of sea level rise in coastal rural communities who were located approximately 4 hours by car from our capital city in the state of Victoria. Many of these communities did not have basic services located in their settlement, and they were also not accessible by public transport. One larger community we did some research with in particular was subject to some significant planning decisions which disallowed a proposal for a particular development on the grounds of sea level rise. And the community were then subject to some really strict planning controls while the state government took some more time to work out its statewide approach to sea level rise. And these caused some big concerns for the community members there. Traditionally, when we've thought about decision-making for climate change adaptation, we often view these in terms of thinking about procedural and distributive justice. However, our research with these communities regarding the planning decision-making and thinking about sea level rise, we found that in thinking about climate change adaptation for sea level rise in these remote rural communities, that there were additional issues of fairness to consider, including temporal, spatial, and also interactional. And we developed some theory around this and also a guide to practitioners to help with this. So the temporal issues were thinking now and making decisions now for something that they viewed was happening so far away in terms of sea level rise. Spatially, why did these small communities have to take actions now when the capital city didn't have to? And also in terms of interactional, they felt that the governments weren't properly involving them at all levels with decision making. In your conclusion, Theresa, you mentioned two things that I wanted to particularly remark upon and that particularly resonated with me. So firstly, that we're all connected. And I think that this is true of so many issues. COVID, as you discussed, is a real example, and also climate change. And, with climate change, our greenhouse gas emissions are shared globally. And we need to work better to understand the intragenerational and intergenerational inequities related to climate change, particularly in relation to, those individuals and nations that are largely responsible for climate change and those who are most vulnerable to the climate change impacts and the inequalities that exist there. And that's why countries like Australia, who have benefited from a history of high greenhouse gas emissions, must take significant actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And we must also commit to assist countries who have not benefited from that level of development arising from greenhouse gas emissions, both in the process of development and in adapting to the changes in climate that are going to occur. And I must say that I often feel uncomfortable living as a citizen in Australia, for being a country that hasn't committed to such actions. So secondly, your conclusion about only being as strong as our most vulnerable, and that is something that really concerns me here in Australia, and I think we need to pay better attention to. In terms of climate change, traditionally in urban planning, we've looked to the past to understand how to develop in the future. But with climate change, we can't do this anymore. We need to really look to the future. And we need to ensure that the actions we take now don't increase the vulnerability of future generations, particularly in relation, if we think about sea level rise, building on land now that we know is going to be underwater in a few decades' time. So we need to think about who's going to benefit from these actions, who's going to lose out, and understand these inequalities and address these now in our decision making so we don't increase vulnerability into the future. So thank you, Theresa, for sharing your work and the experience of the favela residents with us today.
Thanks very much, Anna, for making that connection also with the ways in which vulnerabilities are playing out in Australia. With that, I'd like to pass now to Shipra.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Stephanie. And thanks, Theresa, again. Like Anna, I really enjoyed that wonderful, inspiring keynote. It's a real privilege to be on this platform with all of you today and to have an opportunity to share some thoughts and reflections. You mentioned, and we know, that 1 billion people across the world live in slums or slum-like conditions. Another 1 billion live in homelessness or inadequate housing. And as Theresa, you put it so eloquently, many of these settlements, like Rio's favelas, are a result of deep-rooted inequalities, in Rio's case going back over 100 years, and the system's abject failure to address these. In fact, what we call spatial inequality, I have to say, seems rather mild. In fact, in this case, is a territorial manifestation of the legacy of slavery. And if we were really to call it out, that would be the case in many parts of the world: a legacy of slavery, a legacy of colonialism, a legacy of discrimination, a legacy of apartheid, various kinds of very uncomfortable legacy. So thank you for calling them out. We also see from your analysis, what I really liked was that many of these so-called slum settlements or informal settlements of favelas actually demonstrate characteristics that well-planned cities and settlements aspire to, that we actively promote, the livability, the compactness, the connectedness, the diversity, the community life, the density, walkability, mixed use, affordability. These are things that planners are in other places promoting, but we often don't recognize these as, what you said, assets or qualities or positive qualities of these communities. I also very much like the tree allegory that you employed, the SDG 11 being the canopy, the SDG 16, justice being the trunk, and other SDGs are branches and parts of the canopy, and the roots, the sense of belonging, the autonomy. Very interesting, and not far from our belief that, first of all SDGs are interconnected, and second, that a human rights-based approach, including social, political, cultural rights, which are also indivisible and interconnected, must underpin all our work. So I found a lot that resonated with me, and let me try and link all of this with what we do at Your Habitat and see where the synergies and convergences and divergences lie. So as you would know, UN Habitat is the human settlements agency of the UN system, the focal point for SDG 11 and all urban-related SDGs, with a long-standing mandate and commitment to adequate shelter, sustainable urbanization, and a better quality of life for all in an urbanizing world. The bread and butter issues that we deal with, housing, informality, water, sanitation, planning, public space, infrastructure, have been spotlighted by COVID-19 like never before. The pandemic is exacerbating vulnerabilities, it's exposing structural fragilities, spatial inequality, inequality in exposure due to environmental injustice. You know, what Anna was also saying, the theme of justice. It has reminded us in the absolute starkest way possible the price we pay for weaknesses in health systems, in social protection, in housing, and public services. We also know that women are hit hardest by the pandemic. More women work in the informal sector. They are harder hit by the loss in livelihoods. Their role as caregivers also means they're balancing many priorities, often at a huge cost to themselves. And gender-based violence is becoming a pandemic in itself in many, many communities, not just poor communities, but many communities across the world. But yet, I think this crisis, like every crisis, also brings with it an opportunity. An opportunity to use the SDGs as the ambitious framework they are to propel us forward with fresh momentum, because we were losing momentum. An opportunity to reform, reconstruct, recover better, and become more resilient. And who is better positioned to teach us about resilience than communities who have struggled and coped and indeed thrived despite the odds through several generations, as you illustrated in your talk, Theresa. UN Habitat believes in the expertise and the power of communities. Through our participatory slum upgrading program, we work in 190 cities across 40 countries, engaging 5 million slum dwellers. Nearly 1 million dwellers have improved tenure security due to these efforts. But at the same time, we have supported the development of 50 national development frameworks and over 30 evidence-based citywide slum upgrading and prevention strategies. And I'll come to why this is important. We also have a new flagship program called Rise Up, which I like for its kind of activist acronym. Resilient Informal Settlements for the Urban Poor is the full name, which aims to mobilize and coordinate large-scale investments for urban adaptation and resilience building, investments that need to go into the global hotspots of vulnerability and which need to work through a new coalition of unusual actors, international to local development partners, climate finance institutions, planning and infrastructure firms, activists, community leaders, other non-government actors, scientists, who will find a new way of working together. And these pro-poor investments will be prepared in close collaboration with the local community, informed by real-life validated data that comes from the communities, and planning practices that also have roots in good traditional practice, supported by local, national, and international technical allies, as you call them. The flagship will be instrumental in addressing two major paradoxes. One, that only 5 to 8% of climate finance goes into adaptation. And I bring it particularly here because the topic is around climate. And only about 10% of the investments made by climate funds reach the local level. So this brings me to the final 3 points I'd like to make, taking the discussion forward from where you left it. One, the importance of linking with citywide planning. It's important that communities don't remain disconnected pockets of not just vulnerability, but also innovation. They have to become integrated within the city, within city systems. And that's extremely important to link them up with planning. Two, the significance of appropriate national policies. No community is an island, no city is an island. And many of the issues that need addressing need alignment between local action, city planning, and national policy and governance. So they need alignment through multiple levels and spheres of governance. This is absolutely critical because the level of impact that we need will not happen without that. And third, the absolute criticality of mobilizing large-scale financing for impact. Finance doesn't get to communities. It doesn't get to where it's needed. And therefore, we really have to take these experiences, take these lessons. I liked your the roots where you talked about the media positioning and the media presentation of the real issues. But really, we have to scale this up, link it with planning, policy, and finance. Without these, our favela communities and other marginalized and ignored communities will continue to be at the fringes, regardless of their efforts. Their efforts will continue to have limited impact. Their assets will remain unleveraged, and their futures will remain precarious. Thank you. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Shipra. Now I'd like to pass to Theresa to give a few responses to the comments that we've had here today.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm just so glad that the keynote was so helpful and stimulated all this discussion. I'm learning a lot from you all. And then I just wanted to make a couple of additional comments so we can get to the questions. The one thing is, every time I've interacted with Australian ceremonies or events, the welcome to country is always something that stands out to me. And last year at an event in Vancouver, they were doing the same in British Columbia. And the idea that you recognize the people who know that place, who belong ultimately most deeply maybe to a place, who are the rightful owners of the land. And so that idea, going back to belonging that we've been talking about, and why belonging is important now that we're talking about sustainability. And one of the things I wanted to reflect on is we have in the Sustainable Favela Network 7 working groups formed sort of organically through the process. Water, gardens and reforestation, water and sewage, gardens and reforestation, solid waste, environmental education, income generation, sustainably, solar energy, and then the final one is memory and culture. And that one seems to stand out to most people as sort of, because the others sound like they're more clearly environmental. But actually, that is the sort of primordial working group, because what people find in favelas, and I think any neighborhood or community or organization, is people who have a sense of belonging, a sense of memory, are the ones who feel a connection to the place, or the ones who care for the place. They're the ones who know it over time. So when we think about Aboriginal or Indigenous communities, they're the ones who know what the land is, how the environment behaves in that place, and how to engage with the environment sustainably. And so I just wanted to sort of bring that back. And also, recently I was listening to a podcast. Economists, one of their major measures for economic development and growth is mobility. So the idea of mobility, of people being able to move, leaving where they're at, leaving their job, and so we've built a system that's built on the idea that mobility is good. Connection to where you are is not necessarily something monetizable or of value. And so now I think it's really important to bring it back into the calculation. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is, I think that the idea of sort of top-down planning or centralized planning or big institutions making the difference. Of course, it's essential to have governments leading all of this. But at the same time, I think that's left behind the strength and importance of communities. And the fact is very simple: if we don't get people engaged in community level, where they sense belonging and they're engaged on a personal, visceral level, we're not going to have a sustainable future. So there's nothing really we can do. I don't personally believe there's any top-down approach or centralized approach that will ultimately get us where we need to go. So we have to find ways to really recognize and strengthen and invest in those local efforts, which often are much more cost-effective if you're thinking financially. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is just the double standard that comes up over and over with this kind of when we're talking about these different approaches. I hear in urban planning, you talk about we talk about tactical urbanism, or we talk about, there's a movement now for dangerous playgrounds. We talk about hacking or maker spaces, all concepts that are actually, or think about UNESCO World Heritage Sites, right? These are all places and things that we view as valuable and productive, but they're basically things that happen in informal settlements all the time. They're just the way things are, without fancy names, without recognition, and why? Because of the people who are doing it, and the way, the systems that we've created that keep those people and ways of life subjugated or precarious and so on. So I just wanted to add that, and then I'm looking forward to our discussion now.
Thanks very much. So I hope people have been posting their questions in the chat. We've got a good amount of time to throw open to our panelists here today. I'd like to kick us off with a question reflecting in a way on the past and on the future. Because I know that you've all been working, for such a long time. And of course, as I said at the beginning, Catalytic Communities is now coming up to its 20th anniversary. And I'm just thinking about how the terrain has changed for the work that you do. Of course, now I think it's very clear that we see the value of working with communities, of valuing local knowledge, of engaging in these types of partnerships, and the SDGs themselves being this incredible landmark win that can be leveraged. And yet here we are, still, the three of us, the four of us now working in this field, clearly still in a space where we have the inequitable intergenerational, distribution of risk, where we haven't been able to reckon with some of these legacies, Shipra, as you put it, with so many different names in so many different places. So where are we today? Where are we today compared to where we were 20 years ago when you started your work, Theresa, or when we started with you in Habitat Shipra? Where were we then, and what has changed about our possibilities today? So I'd like to open that up to all three of our panelists, please. Sorry, perhaps I can start with Theresa.
Okay, thanks for the question. So I mean, the most obvious and important piece is the awareness. There's a huge shift in general awareness on these issues and our perspective on them from when I studied planning 20 years ago to now. And I think that's number one. And with that, we can do a lot. And then from there, I mean, just a couple of very practical things I've seen in communities in Rio in 20 years. Number one, community leaders they're transformed in relation to how they view their role, how they view the state's role. When I started this work, people were, generally speaking, community leaders, when government showed up, it was this sort of sense of gratitude and this sort of subservient, oh, good, finally somebody's here, thank you. And there was, now it's much more of a rights orientation. People know their rights and they're trying to claim their rights, and they may not be getting a response, but at least there's a shift in the perspective, the self-esteem, self-confidence. I lived through a period where where community leaders went through not wanting their communities referred to as favelas, and not referring to themselves as favelados. And now we're in a period where especially young organizers, for them it's like it's a banner of great pride. In fact, there's a term, cria, which means you're born and raised. And there's all sorts of arguments on social media because people from wealthy parts of the city young people are saying, I'm cria from this wealthy neighborhood. And people from favelas are like, no, you're not allowed. Like only cria if you're from the favelas. And so there's just a shift going on. And then finally, this is related to community media, social media, which we are seeing a lot of the negatives of this now with fake news and everything else that we all know about, privacy and everything else. But the reality is that traditional media were only available to the elite, both in production and consumption. And the global elite has always been intricately connected. Whereas low-income people in the same favela may not even have been connected, much less favelas across the same city, much less informal settlements around the world. And there are more and more opportunities for these sorts of massive levels of exchange going on. And community groups in Rio are producing their own media at such a large extent that we haven't stopped to do this yet, but I would actually say that on some, at some level, if you joined all of the community outlets on social media and so on, you probably would get a larger distribution in terms of a major event affecting favelas than you would get from the major daily newspaper in Rio now. There's so many of these local social media channels, WhatsApp groups, people informing themselves and each other, and community groups connected across neighborhoods, sharing information. So I think all of these things are very positive. But I don't think we've gotten where we need to get with any of it yet. Yeah.
Thanks, Theresa. Anna, can I invite you?
Well, thank you, Stephanie. And I guess I'd probably elaborate more, also on and agree with Theresa's points that she's raised, that I think the urgency is really great. I mean, that's what really keeps me up at night, knowing that when we look at our greenhouse gas emissions, the rapid transition that we need, we are not, we haven't made that downward turn yet. And I guess what is politically concerning in Australia is when, I'm not sure which session people attended, but the session I attended last was with John Thwaites presenting the report on Australia's performance on the SDGs, and climate change we were really badly performing in. And again, to reiterate that for a nation like Australia, it's just, not acceptable, I think, that we're turning our backs on this major issue that's going to affect not only our population, but the broader global community. And I think also to draw upon what Theresa was saying is that I do agree that it can't just be top-down decision-making, it has to be bottom-up. And I think there's a reluctance in Australia and perhaps in other contexts to get the community involved, to understand, because, again, thinking about sea level rise, this is a huge issue for Australia, which has many of its urban settlements on coastal locations. And there's a real reluctance to clearly communicate with communities the extent of sea level rise that's going to occur and the consequences of that. And my feeling has always been we should get the community involved, and we should do so sooner rather than later. And it might even help us garner greater action for mitigation, the source of our problem. And I over time, my PhD work was on recycled water and aspects of communicating about water. And again, 20 years ago, seeing the reluctance to trust people to drink water from rainwater tanks in Australia or to manage their tanks properly. And so again, I think there's this divide at times between expert decision makers and the public. And I think we need to really understand the community capacity to take hold of these issues for themselves and make decisions that are largely going to be beneficial, particularly if we, give them the opportunity to understand the issues and take that in their stride. So I think some of my feelings are very similar to what Theresa and you raised, Stephanie.
Thanks very much, Anna. And of course, Shipra.
Thanks. Let me frame this then and now, in the context of the MDGs and the SDGs. The Millennium Development Goals that were adopted in 2000 included, the issue of slums and slum dwellers and informality was kind of a small part of the MDG 7 on environmental sustainability. It wasn't an issue big enough to warrant its own, goal or any kind of a big space. And the targets under that really brought these issues to light were related to water and sanitation, and related to lift 100 million slum dwellers, out of their communities, completely underestimating the dynamics of growth of these communities and how cities grow, and how in that same period, more than 100 million new slum dwellers were added to these communities. So that target was, in hindsight, seen as fairly unambitious and reached quite quickly and did not address the scale and the root of the problems we had. Now, contrast and fast forward to 2015 with the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 11, which was a major win in the sense there was for the first time a goal on cities. It captured a good variety of dimensions around inclusive, sustainable, safe, resilient cities and communities. So its targets include housing and slum upgrading. Its targets include transport, planning, capacity for planning. Very importantly, strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard heritage, cultural and natural. Look at reduce the number of deaths and losses due to disasters, and then look at environmental impact, particularly looking at air quality and waste, and then looking at public space. So for the first time, we've now come to a more holistic approach, a more comprehensive approach, and that's why I was saying the link to not just talking about cities and poor communities or slum communities or informality or housing in isolation from the rest of the environment. I also want to flag one big thing that happened, which was 2003, the UN Habitat Global Report on the Challenge of Slums. I don't know how many of you know it, but as a student in planning school, as a young planner, and even as a practitioner several years later, I fall back on that report quite a lot. The data is outdated, but the analysis and the way it framed and brought the issues to the table was very, very important. Was an absolute milestone contribution. I think the final point, linking with what Anna and Theresa was saying, the agency of people, the agency of communities, rather than looking at them as beneficiaries, but as actors, as leaders, as drivers, as experts, and what I really liked with Theresa's point about us as the rest of us as technical allies, as the support team. That is really, to me, one of the big shifts alongside this shift from MDGs to the way SDGs are framed.
Thanks very much. We have many questions from the crowd now, so I will select one. And I'd like to direct this one to Theresa, which is around, you of course have highlighted in your presentation the number of many successes that you've had through the work of Catalytic communities. And this question comes to say, could you actually talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you might have faced in this pursuit?
Sure, thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot more challenges, I would say, than anything else. This is really a very complicated, complex context. I mean, I didn't even mention the way governance happens here and organized crime and the influence of all of this. Most people have heard of drug trafficking in Rio, but actually these vigilante off-duty police militias now are a bigger concern, even dominating more of the territory and engaged with political actors. Some people are calling the current municipal elections in Rio basically the first major militia elections. So it's very complicated, and we are in this context. So it affects what we do and how much we can do and how much impact we can have. So for example, we have a community land trust project where we're working with communities that are interested in trying to regularize their land rights through a model that mixes collective land and individual homeownership. And, even for that, we're working with very tiny communities initially because we can't even imagine doing this in larger territories yet because of these constraints. So these sorts of challenges impact everything we do, government neglect, and all the things we're talking about in the favelas, disinvestment. So we're working against these huge odds. And then institutionally as our organization, I would say the very first and major challenge to doing what we do in general, So anybody who's interested in doing something like this, the most important thing is trust. So trust building. And I was very lucky that my doctoral advisor, encouraged me to start this organization and make it the topic of my dissertation, because it allowed me to basically spend over a year just listening and talking with local organizers and hearing all of the stories of how other institutions treated them, and referring to themselves as scalded cats, and whether it was government or whether it was even NGOs or academics. And so I sort of built the organization partly around maintaining and strengthening and building trust. So I would say that's a big challenge, but it's one that we have been fortunately able to really manage. But as a result of that leads to another challenge, which is resources, which every nonprofit will talk about. But in our case, we also limited our own ambition for resources because we wanted to maintain trust. So we were aware that if we became a big organization, we would lose the trust, which was actually the ground principle necessary to do this sort of work. So it's been a slow growth process as an organization, which then leads to, and which allows all of this learning, actually, because there's a lot of reflection. So I was able to share that with you in the keynote. But then how do you maintain it for so long? So these are just sort of the kinds of different types of challenges that we face as an organization, and then broadly. But I'd say the biggest challenges really aren't about us. It's about the context that we're working in. And some of the things we're working on are probably much easier applied in other places, but because the context here is so complex. But this is where we're committed to our work. So
we have another question, which is looking at the impacts of social media and how social media is shaping our governance interactions. And in a way, I'd probably extend not just social media, but all new forms of digital technologies and sort of what that's enabling, through digital mapping and so on, but also potentially what new challenges that might actually create if we're thinking about democratization of technology and creating new pathways for engaging with our governance systems. So I wonder if I could invite the panel, perhaps everybody might have something to say on this, really just thinking about what is the role of these new forms of media sources in impacting our urban governance. Perhaps if I can start with Anna. I can see she's nodding quite happily.
Oh, thanks. I think it's really important. I mean, Theresa mentioned the many benefits, which are wonderful, to be able to increase communication between communities that didn't have access to mainstream media, or as much access as mainstream media previously. But my concern is also how it can distort and amplify perhaps vested interests that don't have, the community's interests perhaps at heart. So I think we need to ensure that there are mechanisms for critical analysis and checking in with information that is out there. Because I think when I think of development in Melbourne, it does concern me that particular vested interests that aren't necessarily in the public good do seem to dominate. So we need to ensure that that we can still get that public interest view heard, and that people can still understand the impacts for them. So social media and digital media is good to be able to increase communication, but we really need to make sure that it is done in a fair and equitable way that does represent multiple interests, and that people can understand the inequalities in decisions that might be made. So it's pros and cons, yeah.
As with all in life. Shipra?
Yeah, thanks. Just building up, exactly. And that's exactly what I also want to. I think the advantage of some of these new platforms is the engagement of young people, particularly. Again, saying, that young people, children, when we were growing up, for example, children were not seen as having any agency, as having any role in decision making, as having any understanding of these issues. And now they do. They are much more exposed. They do understand, and yet the traditional systems of governance don't bring them in. They don't bring in their voices, they don't bring in their choices, they don't bring in their leadership, their ideas, their innovations, etc. So in that sense, the new media, the digital platforms, these channels of engagement both ways have been remarkable in terms of what they've done. But at the same time, I completely agree with Anna. There are issues where, there's also the issue of capture and manipulation. And not everybody has the same access, which is where the community media work that you're doing, Theresa, is so important. And public interest is not homogeneous. Public interest is not everybody's interest also. So very often public interest is dominated by middle class interests, which further seek to push, informality to the fringe, out of sight. You can come and work in my house, but I don't need to see you. I don't need to see where you live. I don't need to know how you commute. I don't need to, so public interest is a bit of a misleading thing often, and we have to be careful of media manipulation and whose interest it serves.
Thanks very much, Theresa.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I was mentioning the positives, and the positives were visible to us initially, like 2008 through maybe 2013, 14. We were seeing social media as a very positive force in favelas and in Rio. Then things shifted. And I would say the jury is out on the ultimate benefits versus costs to the world, to society. That said, that has tremendous benefits to the people who use it well. And I think education then comes in, like Anna said. So here in Brazil, you could argue that the current president was elected through WhatsApp, through these fake news currents on WhatsApp. In Brazil, WhatsApp, many people got access to cell phones between his election and the previous one. And the cell phone, these smartphones, and smartphones in Brazil, WhatsApp is free service. So it's for many people, it's the only free internet they have. They can't access websites, they can't access Facebook, but they can access WhatsApp. And it feels very intimate. So you're getting a post someone sends to someone, and it comes from your cousin or it comes from your coworker. And it's very easy to produce these pieces. They're not high, production value. So you're getting this flow of information and there's no way to track it. And so there's quite a widespread understanding that this was a major tool in the last election in Brazil, leading to this current president's victory. And fake news continues to dominate. And so when you have a country that's, most people are highly undereducated because we haven't had good public education historically and currently. And so, people don't know how to, assess the quality of the information, except it's coming from someone they know, so we do need these things to come together with the right types of, media education in general. And I think that's starting to happen a bit more. I've seen some trends in that sense, but, I don't know if we can recover. I'm not sure, not convinced yet.
Great. Now, the organizers have been very generous to give us a few extra minutes. So I think we'll probably need to wrap up now. I know there's a lot more discussion happening in the chat. So please, those who have questions, do try and reach out to our delegates and continue this conversation. I wonder if in just this last minute, I could be a bit cheeky and ask for one final sum up from each of our panel members. I can't help but notice that we have 3 different types of institutions represented here through research, through a kind of UN agency, and of course, the more grassroots civil society organization. And we've all sort of in different ways emphasized the importance of local communities being those agents of change. And what is the role from your positionality in your institutions in supporting that process? Maybe just a final very quick word. If I can start with Shipra.
Thanks very much. So from the perspective of Habitat, really we're looking at strengthening the agency and strengthening engagement of community through linking them up with others who make a difference, with planning and planners, with policymakers at local, regional, national levels, and with finance and with partners who can really bring in the resources that are needed to help these communities develop and survive and thrive and become more sustainable, as Theresa said. So really, I would like to, in closing, again, emphasize the link between community development, asset-based community development, and its integration with citywide planning, policymaking, national policymaking, and finance.
Fantastic. Anna?
Thank you, Stephanie. I guess the Australian higher education system is in a particular position at the moment where a lot of our funding's under threat, and it puts us in a vulnerable position. And I guess a lot of us are reflecting on that at present. And I think we're one of the diverse and independent voices, which is really important. And I hope that we can maintain that. And I guess my message is that we need diversity and inclusion of all voices so that we do understand what the complexity of the problems are, so that the solutions that we come up with are robust, and whether that be, all actors at all levels. And I guess that's just something that I think is important to leave with.
Fantastic. And Theresa, last word.
I think one of the surprising things we found this year with COVID here in Rio is communities not only responding with actions around food delivery or information around COVID, but actually data collection. And I talked about that a little bit in the presentation. And just thinking about, how much communities can do if they're invested in and supported, and how much we could engage people in to empower and create more agency, more connection. And it's very efficient to do this. Ultimately, it just takes more creativity. It takes tailoring. It takes getting to know people. These are things that aren't necessarily embedded in our public systems, but they should be. And so I just think that we should be taking lessons from this moment, like has been talked about here a lot today, and invest in communities doing things that we wouldn't imagine they would do, and strengthen those local efforts.
Thank you. Well, with that, a huge thank you also, of course, to our panel, who are incredible, and to our two interpreters, Jerry and Megan, who have been doing an amazing job keeping up with this fast-paced conversation.